last week we started a series here called Impact on how our lives can impact the other lives around us and ultimately even our world. And we talked about how you need to get a mission and figure out what it is God's calling you to, what He's gifted you for, what He's resourced you with in order to make that impact. Threaded throughout this, woven throughout this series is the Great Commission of Jesus, His last words to His disciples, where He said, you got a job now, and it's to go make disciples or followers of me here and everywhere else in the world. And in another place in the book of Acts, it says, you're to be my witnesses, or giving a testimony to who I am in the world. It's who the church is. That's who we are as followers of Jesus. And you see a little video like that, and it inspires us, good music. We need to make a difference in needs in the world. And then we challenge everybody to do that, and we feel something, and then we pray the benediction, we go home and go back to business as usual, right? I mean, that's how we make an impact, right? Just do the same thing that's the issue. That's a problem we have. Now, I have a question for you. What makes you mad? What gets you mad? Is it, clothes on the floor that upsets you? Is it perhaps somebody cutting you off on the highway? Is it, karaoke at dinner? Or, that bothers you? You can't stand it. I hate karaoke at dinner. My wife starts singing randomly all the time. And it's funny. My next question is, and when you're mad, what do? Do you yell and scream and swear? Is that what you do when you get mad? Do you punch a wall? Do you go out and eat a whole bag of gummy bears? That's a long story, and I can't tell you about it, and Stephanie knows nothing about it, but I've grown up a lot since yesterday. All right, so I want to draw your attention then to this whole idea of getting mad today. Because oftentimes, when we're mad, we're motivated to action. And some people, it takes them getting mad before they do anything about the stuff they see happening around them. And it's interesting, when we say that, people say, well, wait, Steve, I thought there was all this Bible stuff about not getting mad and about keeping our temper under control. Well, okay, with that in mind, I'm just going to read a little verse to you here from Ephesians chapter 4. And here's what he says, just to kind of introduce this whole topic. Paul says this, if you're in your anger, do not sin. So, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Now, Paul's making it clear in this verse, right? We get angry. I mean, it's clear, we do. We're wired that way. Something makes you mad. Sometimes you start to feel it, like first in your toes, and then it starts to go up through your whole body. You feel the heat, right? And if it's something that really angers you, all of a sudden the rage is there. And for some of us, it's more obvious as the heat comes out than it is for others. But we can still be angry and not sin. That's what he's talking about is important. He's explaining, take care of disagreements. If you're having angry feelings towards someone, resolve all of those because we need to love each other. Don't even let the sun go down being angry at a person in your life. But then we have to look at the Bible and say, but what about when Jesus got angry? What happened when Jesus got angry in terms of the action that he took? And I just want to lay it out like this. For us to have an impact in the world, we should get mad about the things that Jesus got mad about. And I'm going to read you a story, and it's actually in all four Gospels of the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All four of them included this story. Now, I think if a story appears once in one Gospel, it's still really important. But the fact that all four of these Gospel writers decided to include this story tells you just how important it is. And here it is, Mark 11, and I know what happens. A lot of people, they love this story because when they get fired up and lose their temper and they get all mad, they say, well, Jesus got mad. Yeah, but what did Jesus get mad about and how did he get mad? Mark 11, again, it's in all four, but I'm going to use the Mark story. Verse 15, on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you've made it a den of robbers. So what is this whole episode and what's making Jesus so mad? If he was mad about these things, should I get mad about the same things he was mad about? So I'm gonna just point out a few things that he's dealing with here this morning and then ask you, do I need to get mad? And here's the first thing that he was attacking in this whole situation: spiritual arrogance. Now, those two words together don't even sound like they go together, right? I mean, if I'm spiritual, I'm not arrogant. Well, see, that's just it. Some people are. Some people are arrogant in their spirituality. They love to point out to everyone else how spiritual they are. And they love to make sure everyone else knows that they're not as spiritual as they are. A lot of humility lost in their spiritual passion. And these religious leaders that were in charge of this temple were the perfect example of what we're talking about in spiritual arrogance. This whole temple activity is what they were responsible to make sure happened, not only inside the temple, but these courts where Jesus walked in and turned over all these tables. They're responsible for that activity as well. And so for the convenience of travelers who'd come in to the temple area, they allowed all of these salespeople to put forth the sacrifices in the temple courts. So here they are, all the smelly cattle, doves. They even had the money exchangers. Like go to the airport, and you go into a foreign country and you got to turn your dollars into whatever currency it is. Well, that happened here. They had to have shekels for what was called the temple tax, and yet they had Roman money. So these guys would exchange currency there in the temple courts, so people had the shekels to actually offer their tax. So think about it for a second. Wait a minute. Why is he getting upset about this? They're just providing a service of selling the sacrifices. They're providing a service of exchanging the money. Why is he so mad about it? Well, he's mad about it because of where they were doing it and what it meant. These courts were to be places of worship and prayer, and the temple leaders were allowing the desecration of that space. He actually even quotes Isaiah, the prophet, when he says, "My house will be called a house of prayer." Now, it's probable that these religious leaders were taking a cut of the profits from all these guys, and so they wanted it to be as easy and convenient as possible for everybody to exchange their money there. But as a result, they desecrated space designated to honor the Lord. Now, Jesus takes this opportunity then to express his disgust with the arrogance of these religious leaders who thought that they could just do whatever they wanted to do with their power and authority. And it's interesting, I think, if you read the passage carefully, actually read the versions of the story in the other Gospels, I think Jesus is actually more angry with these religious leaders than he is the vendors themselves. Even though it's the vendor stuff that got all turned over. It's interesting, the leader's response. They don't ask him, why are you doing this? They pause and say, who gives you the authority to do this? Or you've asked the question, right? Who do you think you are? And here he is explaining to them that this is not a place for you to do business. It's a place for you to worship. And I think these leaders saw his growing popularity with his miracles and his really radical teaching, and they saw a threat to their own leadership, their own power. They're more concerned with their status than his actual action. Would this be yet another radical act that's going to get him more and more followers and put pressure on us? See, Jesus, get this, Jesus is directly challenging the hearts and spirits of the religious people again. Religious people. So I want you to keep that in mind because we're all here in church today. Many of us would consider ourselves spiritual. Many of us would consider ourselves passionate about God. But the question is, how do we look at other people who aren't? And perhaps people who aren't in the same place we are in our spiritual passion. Now, I know you're all sanctified. I get it. Okay, here's the question. Was Jesus in a rage in this moment? Was he out of control? Because at first glance, when you read it, you might think that he kind of was. And John even says, the gospel writer John says, he even grabbed some cords and made a whip. So now in Mark's passage, we didn't get that. Now you add that to the whole thing. He's out there snapping a whip like a raving lunatic going through the temple courts. And people are like, he's crazy. Is he? You see, the reality is the whip would create a sound that would get the people's attention. And then those stories also say that he was getting the cattle off of the temple courts. He was getting them out of the way. Well, usually a little, here lammy, here ram, that doesn't work. And so he was using force to remove them from the place. And it's interesting, though, when you see it all, here's how Mark puts it. Mark uses the phrase, as he taught them. As he taught them. Not the picture of a raving lunatic, but someone who was just hot with emotion, moving these things off of what he knew to be sacred space. But he was in control of his emotions. He did not let his emotions get control of him. Maybe we should all say that or something. I was emotional, but I didn't let my emotions control my thoughts and ultimately my actions. Listen, that's why Jesus' actions don't become an excuse for what some of us might like to use as an excuse, righteous indignation, If when we get mad, then we all of a sudden try to sanctify our anger and say, oh, it was righteous indignation. When really we were just stinking mad. He was intentionally and methodically teaching with authority that the temple of God was not a place for activity inconsistent with prayer and worship and reverence for God. Now, I pause here at this point and say, if I'm going to make an impact on the world, I first need to start with being passionate about worship and prayer and service to God. And actually, John quotes from Psalms where his disciples remembered that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. You see, what made Jesus mad is apathetic, lethargic, casual belief. People who weren't really passionate about their worship, but people who just wanted to appear religious. And of course, that has to cause us to pause and say, what about me? Am I passionate about my faith and my prayer? Do I have the zeal for the house of the Lord like Jesus had? Jesus wanted the temple to be a focus of business, not a place for profit-making or business networking. It's interesting, when we got this building, when we received it, and it was a huge blessing to us, we made a commitment that we were going to have the doors of this building open to our community when our community needed it. We wanted to serve our community, and yet everything that was going to be according to our mission, we were going to open up the doors. We're not going to charge people for it. We get those calls all the time. Can you rent us a room? No, we can't rent you a room, but we'll let you use one if it's something that's a part of our mission. Now, here's the thing. We've been called before from people who just said, I want to sell this, or I want to have a meeting for this kind of a deal, whatever. And we say, no, that's not what we're about. We're happy to let community people use it, but we're not about using this place for a place of business. And that's because it's devoted to the mission God has called us to. Impacting people toward Jesus requires that same spirit of humility Jesus demonstrated when he came to our world. The question is, do I have that spirit? Not arrogance where I look down on people because they don't have the gift I have, or they don't use the language I use, or they don't know as many verses as I know, or they're not at all the services that I'm at. But rather, with humility, I approach people with love and compassion. Now, it's interesting, those are the people, the spiritually arrogant, Jesus was really mad at. But he didn't stop there. Because he also was mad because of the injustice of the poor and the lost. And you may not see that in the story at first. When you just read it, you're like, I just see a guy getting mad, flipping tables over, crazy. Well, read it closer. One of the courts was designated for the Gentiles who were there to worship God. Gentiles were people who weren't part of the Jewish nation. And yet they were impressed with the message, and they believed in the God of the Jews. And so they were allowed to come to the temple courts, particularly the Gentile court, to worship and pray. And yet that was the very location that the temple leaders, the Pharisees, the religious elite, were putting the cattle. So imagine Here's this court devoted to prayer for the Gentiles, now filled with cows and lambs, and now filled with doves and all of this smell and this noise, taking up the place of prayer. Jesus is making it clear. His personal temple, himself, fulfills Isaiah and Jeremiah's prophecy about salvation from God, that it's to be, listen, shared with all the people of the world. The arrogance on these Jewish leaders was that they were special, they were God's chosen, and everybody else were the unclean, unwashed masses. And Jesus said, no, we're all to be loved by God. But he doesn't stop with the disenfranchised aliens that were coming in to worship. He continues and quotes another prophet, Jeremiah. And he says this, "But you have made it a den of robbers." Now, you might hear that and you think, well, I get it. They're stealing maybe, or they're abusing people, or they're not being fair in their business dealings. Den of robbers. That's not really the context at all. If you read that verse in the context that Jeremiah used it, it was all about how they were manipulating, taking advantage of, and extorting from the poor. From the poor. Vendors worked for the leaders, and they took advantage of the poor travelers coming to worship. And notice he even emphasizes, he turned over the benches of those selling the doves. You see, most poor people couldn't afford a lamb. Most poor people couldn't afford a bull. They couldn't afford those things. And so their offering, according to the law, was to offer 2 doves. So they're there selling the doves, and Jesus throws those over because he knew that they were overcharging them, and he knew that they couldn't afford what they were doing, and they were exploiting these poor people's passion to worship God. Now you think about that. Jesus was showing his disgust for how the religious elite were treating the most vulnerable of society, the foreigner and the poor. I want you to pause for a second and think, what has my attitude been toward the poor, toward the foreigner? No doubt about it, Jesus came to this world to pour out God's hope and compassion upon the invisible, the weak, and the marginalized of society. But let me dive on that word invisible. Because see, this is what happens to us in our spiritual arrogance. We say, well, I don't have animosity toward anybody. I don't want to hurt anybody that's poor. I don't want to take advantage of it. No, what we do is ignore the poor. We just forget they're there. We just get busy in our own life, distracted with our own trappings and all of the things that cause us to have our mind set on the things of our life that we just choose not to think about the poor. And it's interesting how we can have judgments about them because we don't take the time to get to know them. I used to do this as a youth pastor in Lancaster, in Ohio. We had an organization, a great ministry called Foundation Dinners. And we would take our students to go serve meals at this place to people who were really in need. And yet what we required of them is to come and serve, and then they had to get their own meal and go and sit down with the people and get to know them. Because, it's easy to sit there and make ourselves feel good about ourselves, right? I scooped out some food, put it on a plate for somebody who needed it. Oh, aren't I really spiritual and aren't I really compassionate? But what about taking a plate of food and actually sitting down and eating with them and getting to know them as a neighbor, getting to know them as a person who is in my community? And it was amazing how as our students began to talk to them, they found out why they're in the situation that they're in. They began to understand them a lot better. Because you know what? Sometimes we can find ourselves judging the poor. I mean, we can. We can say, are you kidding me? In this economy, we see signs up everywhere, hiring, job fair. I mean, there's all these opportunities. Why can't those people get off their rear ends and go get a job? And that's immediately what happens in our mind. And, maybe some should. But the problem is we don't understand the mentality of poverty. We don't begin to understand how a person can feel so trapped in it that they can only think about how they're going to get a sandwich today. And that's all their mind can do. And until someone comes beside them and helps them and invests in them and gets to know them and becomes their friend, only then can they begin to understand with compassion what a person in poverty is going through. You see what I'm saying? How spiritual arrogance can actually just feed right into hurting the lost and the poor. And so I think Jesus got mad about more than just what he got mad about at the temple that day. And so I've brought a bonus point for you today. I know you're excited when I give you bonus points. Okay, I thought that was funny, but we'll go on from there. Luke chapter 17, there's one more thing that Jesus said that I want to point out today. He said a lot of things. Honestly, this topic is very difficult to pack into a one Sunday morning message, and maybe we'll do a whole series on it. But I want you to see this. Luke 17. Jesus said to his disciples, he's teaching his disciples now alone with them, things that cause people to stumble are bound to come, but woe to anyone through whom they come. It would be better for them to be thrown into the sea with a millstone tied around their neck than to cause one of these little ones to stumble. You know what makes Jesus mad? Causing little ones, he puts it, to stumble. Now, a lot of people quote this verse and they think he's talking about children. Well, he might be talking about children, but when you read it in two other gospels, this whole quote, he's talking about those who have chosen to believe in him, particularly those who've recently made that decision to become a follower of his. And he's saying, I'm adding this to the list. Let me just pause here. I'm adding this to the list because it actually ties in well with the whole purpose of his cleansing of the temple. When you participate in destroying a person's faith in Jesus with your ridicule or causing doubt in them, or you condemn them for failure, you find yourself in a position of raising the ire of God. Hear me, because he said it, not me. I'm just telling you what he said. Jesus paints a picture of how he looks at this. Did you hear it? Woe to anyone who caused this stumbling in a little one. Woe. I mean, we don't use the word woe and like woe, or woe to a horse. But woe is actually a little word that means strong judgment. Woe or strong judgment to the person who causes a new believer, a young believer, a weak believer to stumble. And he even says, just so you know how clear I am about this, he even gives you a mental picture. Better to be thrown into the sea with a millstone around their neck. I mean, seriously, there's something worse than that? I mean, a millstone is the stone that they would grind their grain on so that they could ultimately turn it into bread and things like that. It was a very, very important part of everyone's family. As a matter of fact, in the Levitical law, you could not take a person's millstone from them. And it was huge, 1,600 pounds or more was a millstone. So you get that in your mind now. And Jesus said, if you cause a person to stumble, it'd be better if we tied one of those 1,600-pound millstones around your neck and threw you into the sea. I mean, I'm already saying that's not a good thing. And he said, it'd be better for you if you do that. I think woe is serious. Would you not agree? And he's saying because you should be caring for the weak, the struggling, the new believer, the failing. So let's be clear. Causing people to stumble in their faith because you ridicule them or condemn them makes Jesus mad. And not only does it make him mad, he says, and there'll be consequences for that. See, remember who he's talking to here. He's talking to the religious. I get it all the time. People think that I ought to get up and rail about all these things that are happening in our nation. And yet it's unbelievers who are doing this. Why should we be surprised? But he's talking to believers. And he's saying to us, we need to care about the least of these. We need to care and make an impact. Now, why tie this into it all? Well, because spiritual arrogance and injustice of the weak will bear a consequence in your life that you need to recognize as serious. We need to make clear the judgment of God for those who bring harm upon the vulnerable. And I need to care more than just being nice to them. More than that. And so let me just give you an example. When Meredith first graduated from college, she went to Washington to intern for an organization called the International Justice Mission. Now, like a lot of, helicopter dads, I want to find out all about it. And so I start reading up on the International Justice Mission, and I start reading books by the founder, Gary Haugen. And in reading those books, I was awakened. I mean, I knew it was out there, but I guess I didn't really realize just how bad it was. I was awakened to the vast, vast use of sex trafficking. And particularly how children would be kidnapped from their families and taken into the sex trade. And that little children, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, are being sold to grown men. Listen, that ought to make you mad. You should care about that. And I didn't know. I wasn't aware. And I began to understand it more and more. And the more I read about it, the madder I got. And the madder I got, that's when I began to take action. That's when I began to send money to organizations that help with that. That's when I began to pray for them and began to write to our elected officials about how prevalent this problem is. And I was blown away last time I was in Cyprus when my taxi driver began to celebrate and telling me about his last vacation on a sex trip in Thailand because he was so happy that the little boys were right there near the hotel. I was blown away. Now, come on. There's a lot of stupid stuff that makes us mad. But that's the kind of stuff that Jesus got mad about and ought to make us mad as well. Mad so we take action. You see, have you received God's grace in your life and received His forgiveness and the celebration you have in your own mind that I have eternal life? Awesome. That's what I want. That's why we built this place, so people would know about that. We want you to experience that. I hope you do. But now that you have, so what? What do you do with that? Am I as mad at sin and injustice of the world as God was when He came to my rescue? I mean, do I take it as seriously as He does? Or am I too busy, too distracted, too apathetic? Am I so self-righteous that I think to myself even, you know what, those countries are godless and so those guys are just getting what they deserve. That's just part of the curse. Is that how I feel? I mean, you've been given so much. Abilities and resources and support and knowledge and this great salvation, believers. Will you ask the Lord to break your heart and make you mad at the evil that brings brokenness to people and destroys lives? The bottom line is there is stuff in this world that's going on that if we pay even a little bit of attention to, it should really anger us. Undeserved poverty should make me mad. Pray about the solutions. Maybe be the change for just one person out there. Maybe you find just one person who you can help who needs it. Sex trafficking should make me mad. How can I support International Justice Mission? How can I support OMS's Hope 61? How can I support those people? What can I do to help? Child abuse. It should make me mad. And when I see something happen, I should report it. I should want to do something about it. Racism should make me mad. Especially when they're driving cars into crowds of people. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that should call me to my knees. And yet when I see families being destroyed by the personal slavery of opioid addiction, I should not just be reading this in the paper like, so what? They should have never tried it the first time, let alone become, I can have this attitude. Or I can say, you know what? I'm so sick of the devil, and I'm so sick of the pain that he's causing in this world. I want to do something about it. But the truth is, to start making an impact, you probably first need to get a little mad at yourself. A little mad at yourself. For letting selfishness and letting distraction and letting your own prosperity take your mind off of the suffering of people. And we ought to start taking our relationship with Jesus seriously because that made him mad. Not being flippant about worship and prayer in the house of God or the people of God. No apathy toward injustice and violence, and definitely don't want to be part of causing people to stumble. But when we don't take our sins seriously, we forget that God did. and went to a lot of trouble to forgive us, rescue us, redeem us. And maybe it's time for me to repent. Maybe it starts with me recognizing the flaws and failures in who I am and confessing it to him. You know, the word repent means that there's sorrow involved, there's feeling involved. And perhaps I start by getting mad at me. And then I begin to look at the world around me and recognize change inside means change in my action, my priorities. And when I get mad about the things Jesus got mad about, only then will I be passionate enough to make a powerful and positive difference in the world. So really today, I'm putting that story and Jesus' teaching in front of you and asking you to pray a simple prayer. Jesus, make me mad at what makes you mad. So I'm just telling you, it's getting angry about evil that ultimately can inspire you to make an impact.